What if I told you that breakfast being the most important meal of the day was wrong?
And so, that's kind of the common prevailing theme of, oh, well, don't change your diet, just take this drug. These drugs that have really kind of taken off, diabetic, here in the United States right now, these GLP-1 agonists, Ozempic, Wegovy. And because in many ways, people don't have to change their habits. Autophogy is when your body goes in and gets rid of disease-disordered cells. So it's getting rid of.
But where's the cutoff point?
Yeah, and this is a highly personal issue. So I always say.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This week's guest is the amazing Cynthia Thurlow. We're going to talk about the power of fasting, how it can prevent disease and reverse aging. All very exciting. If you're new here, my name is Anthony Walsh, and my goal with this show and this channel is to introduce you to the people and ideas to optimize your health, your happiness, and your longevity. So take a second and hit the subscribe button because we're bringing new videos every week. Now let's get into the show. Cynthia, welcome to the Roadman Cycling Podcast.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm glad that we were able to coordinate our calendars to make it happen.
I want to take a little bit of a U-turn and talk about fasting. I know there's a large portion of our audience that are curious about it because it's something I've mentioned that I do on the podcast quite a number of times. For me, there's maybe a dual benefit to it. There's the benefit, which I'm sure you're going to explain much more than I can and much more eloquently. Cellular autophagy. It's something that's invisible and I don't know what's going on there. I'm just told it's happening, so I believe it's happening. But for me, the big one, especially when I was trying to shed some weight, was the compressed feeding window. If you're fasting for 16 hours, so I wasn't really having my lunch until 2 o'clock and then my last meal at like 8 o'clock, even as a very undisciplined person, it's difficult to do very much damage in such a small window. Like your satiety levels are pretty good. Like I'm feeling pretty fulfilled after a meal. It needs to be a bit gluttonous to exceed your daily caloric intake in that compressed window.
Autophagy is when your body goes in and gets rid of disease-disordered cells. So it's getting rid of diseased organelles, mitochondria. Mitochondria are powerhouses of our cells. There's something called mitophagy, which is recycling of disease-disordered mitochondria. But it's helping people understand it's like effectively your body is taking out garbage. It's things that have the potential to go on and create cellular injury. They can be things that have the potential to go on and be precancerous cells. And so one of the reasons why we see so much metabolic disease right now, it has a lot to do with this meal frequency. So autophagy, improvement in biophysical markers, when we're in this unfed state, we'll get improvement in our blood pressure, lipids. So triglycerides, HDL, LDL typically will improve. More often than not, if people are new to fasting, they may actually require less medication for blood pressure, for diabetes, etc. Helping people understand that when we're in an unfed state, we're lowering intrinsic inflammation in the body. So this is when people may report, I have less joint pain, I have less bloating, I'm less constipated. There's something called the migrating motor complex. And this is an intrinsic mechanism that's in our digestive system. And when we're eating too frequently, it doesn't allow this janitor of our digestive system to actually push food forward in a way that is getting rid of pathogens, things that do not belong. But we actually need 4 to 5 hours in between our meals. And that's so contrary to everything.
That's interesting.
It's like my nerdy migrating. The MMC is really, really cool. But helping people also understand that we're lowering our likelihood of developing neurocognitive issues just by eating less frequently. So Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's.
Is there diminishing marginal returns at any point on this? Like if I don't eat for 16 hours, I'm experiencing it. But what if I don't eat for 18 days? It's an extreme example, but where's the cutoff point?
Yeah, and this is a highly personal issue. So I always say my lean patients, and I include myself in this, I don't do long fasts anymore. I don't fast more than 24 hours because you have this point to which you will start to break down muscle. And I'm so protective of muscle at this point in my life that I'm not willing to run the risk of having some degree of catabolism. So right around that 24-hour mark, I think for lean, active adults, if someone's obese or overweight, you can do 2 or 3 day fasts, sometimes as long as 4 or 5 days fast. When it's over 5 days, I like it to be medically supervised, which means you just have the oversight of a healthcare professional, because you may likely need less medication for your blood pressure. You may need less diabetes medication. And so, that's kind of the cutoff for me personally. Like, you could do a 5-day unassisted fast, making sure you're well hydrated with electrolytes, etc. But I find, getting up to that 5-day point. The other thing is, there are clearly people who should not fast. And I'm pretty outspoken about these. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding.
Maybe talk to me a little bit about those two, the compressed feeding window and the cellular autophagy.
Yeah, no, I think autophagy is like one of these topics that for me is probably one of the biggest benefits. So for your listeners, this is talking about this waste and recycling process that goes on in an unfed state. Obviously, the longer you fast, the more upregulation in autophagy. And there's a lot of discussion/arguments about, we can't measure it. How do we know how many hours we have to be fasting? And so I always caution people, like, don't get so fixated on the hours, but focus more on the benefits that are going on in an unfed state. So if you have a disordered relationship with food, whether it's anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, although I do, of course, have exceptions. I've met women in particular who have healed from their eating disorders and have been able to fast effectively. But that, again, is really dependent on the input of their therapist, clinical psychiatrist, or psychologist. And then also thinking about, someone that is over fasting, overtraining, over exercising. I do see that triad quite a bit. And these are the individuals that they're exercising intensely all the time without any rest days. And rest days are important. These are individuals that are fasting, 20 to 24 hours a day. Maybe they're eating one meal a day, chronically, habitually. And then on top of that, they're super restrictive with their diet, almost to the point of true orthorexia, where they don't eat anything that they consider to be unhealthy. And they're just chronically undernourishing their bodies. And that triad is something that I've started to speak more openly about, because I do see on social media, there are people that I suspect actually have pretty significant eating disorders, but they'll hide it under the guise of, oh, I'm intermittent fasting. So if you're not nourishing your body, you're eating one meal a day kind of habitually, you can't hit those protein macros, you're over exercising without rest days. And something specific to women, if women lose their menstrual cycle, that is absolutely a sign that it's too much stress for their bodies, even if they're at a position in their lives where they don't want to have children at that time.
We've such an unhealthy relationship with food in cycling. I've had a lot of female pro cyclists on the sport, and this will show you how fucked up their relationship is. Some of their relationships with diet, that it's a badge of honor to not be getting your menstrual cycle.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, I remind people that it's a barometer of our health. So just like blood pressure, just like pulse, just like temperature, not getting your menstrual cycle is not a badge of honor. It is actually a sign that your body perceives it is under way too much stress. And I have met and spoken to many female athletes who shared the same thing with me. And I was so troubled, because what many women don't realize is, if you're a younger woman, let's say you're under the age of 35 and you're not getting a menstrual cycle because your hormone levels are just so depleted, you're putting yourself at risk for the same things that menopausal women are at risk for: bone issues, heart health, brain health, cognition. So those are things I worry about. Like, it's very different if you're a 55-year-old woman versus a 25-year-old woman that's essentially in a state where you're in premature ovarian insufficiency. Very, very different, but could potentially be catastrophic for their health long term.
And if you're to go on the longer side of these fasts, how long do we need to be fasting to start seeing benefits like stem cell activation?
You're really looking at 4 and 5 day fasts. I mean, some people will say 3 to 5 days, but if you follow Walter Longo's work, or if you look at a lot of the information on telomere activity and stem cell activation, you're really looking at the longer fasts. And you really have to buffer that with what is in your best interest. Like, obviously, if it's someone that's dealing with a cancer diagnosis in conjunction with their oncologist blessing, those longer fasts may be of benefit to them, versus someone that's really lean and very young. I would not be pushing people to do, especially women in particular, because there's so many things that are going on in terms of their body's awareness of nutrient depletion, and reduction in reserves. So I think if you were to say to me, Cynthia, twice a year I want to do a 4 or 5 day fast, that's probably okay, but you're also not going to be doing heavy training at that time. You might go and take a walk, but you're not going to be getting on your bike and doing a 100-mile bike ride. or 100-kilometer bike ride for that matter, you're going to be conscientious about, what activities you're doing around those longer fasts. I don't do longer fasts anymore. And without, boring you with too much information, prior to that second TED Talk, I spent 13 days in the hospital and lost 15 pounds. And so since that time, it has been, an uphill battle to put that muscle back on. And so for me, I've had the longest period of not eating, and I don't ever hope to replicate that again. So for me, 24 hours is about where I hit.
So when you're breaking that fast, I think I definitely figured out the way not to break the fast. I went on a 3-day fast last year and then broke it by just like panic driving to Subway with 2 foot-long meatball marinara. I just didn't feel good about it. Like, you shouldn't fast for 3 days and then feel like you're fat after it just because you had 2 meatball marinaras.
Yeah, typically I will say that the longer the fast, the lighter the meal. So if you're doing a 3-day fast, actually thinking about the fact that you could conceivably, sit down and have some bone broth. Maybe you have a light salad. Maybe you have a small piece of fish. You're going to think about leaner, non-fatty proteins. That's probably an easier way to kind of acquiesce into reestablishing, kind of an eating ritual. A very heavy, fatty meal can, for many people, cause diarrhea, or because their small intestine has kind of had a couple days of reprieve, and then all of a sudden it just hasn't caught up with the fact that this massive bolus of food came. And I do find that smaller meals, and I think this is a degree of experimentation, but it's been more my clinical experience that the longer the fast, the lighter the meal, and just really being thoughtful about cooking the vegetables if you're going to have vegetables, eating a leaner piece of meat or fish, or even just eggs. Like, I find for me, a lot of times just making like a couple eggs without the bacon, I do really well with.
If we look at the predominant narrative that's been pushed for the better part of a decade, it's the idea of eating small amounts of frequent meals to maybe keep the metabolism fired up. Now, we could probably speculate for the rest of the day about who pushes this narrative, but there's definitely some hard stats that are unignorable. Like, I think America makes up less than 5% of the world's population, but consumes over 65% of the world's pharmaceutical products. The link between diet and health is kind of unescapable.
Yeah. I mean, and right now, the latest statistic prior to the pandemic was that 88.2% of Americans were metabolically healthy. And now it's 92 to 93%. So we're heading in the opposite direction. And unfortunately, the way the kind of prevailing allopathic medical model is here in the United States is that it doesn't matter if you have to be on more medication to treat your blood pressure or your diabetes or your cholesterol. We don't spend time talking to our patients about lifestyle as medicine. And so we just condition our patients to believe that high blood pressure is inevitable. They're going to get obese. They're going to sleep really poorly. They're going to have achy joints. And I'm here to say it should be completely the antithesis of that. I see hundreds and hundreds of women that come through my programs and in my practice that we kind of flip that narrative, and they start to understand, like, your quality of sleep, the foods you choose to eat, whether you choose to exercise or not, how you manage your stress, those 4 variables have more impact on whether or not you'll ever have a chronic disease than just about anything else. And so I kind of feel like in a lot of different ways, I've gone back to my roots. Certainly I spent 16 years in clinical cardiology. You better believe all I did was write prescriptions, hundreds and hundreds of scripts a year, until I couldn't do it anymore. Because I kept saying, why are we writing prescriptions for things that are lifestyle mediated? And I remember my colleagues thought I was crazy. And I kept saying, really, if we could teach people how to sleep, how to eat, how to move their bodies, how to manage their stress, they would need a lot less medication. And so here in the United States, it's completely normal to have the pharmaceutical industry that really heavily influences providers and the way we prescribe. And they heavily market on TV. So for anyone who still watches TV, I don't know many people that do, because most people stream because it's so easy to have instant gratification. I think on a lot of different levels, you start to see the pharmaceutical industry has hijacked medicine. And that in and of itself has had a very detrimental effect on our health overall.
I rewatched your TED Talk last week in advance of our chat, and 4 years ago now, and there's over 14 million views on that, which is crazy. But you opened that TED Talk with the phrase, "What if I told you breakfast being the most important meal of the day was wrong?" That statement then was quite against the grain, and it had some shock value even when you dropped it to the audience that was there. Do you think people still have the same viewpoint about that statement?
It's a great question. I know there were a lot of snickers in the audience when I said that. People were like, what? I think there's growing awareness about when we choose to break our fast. So that's what actually breakfast represents, breaking our fast. But I think many people are starting to realize that the gimmicks, the potions, the pills, the powder, especially here in the United States, that, these temporary fixes for a long-term problem are not effective. And I think that is why people are there's growing awareness around the foods we choose to break our fast with, when we choose to break our fast. I think there's growing awareness. I think there's less, people think of it as being new and novel, but I remind people, the concept of fasting dates back to biblical times. But having said that, I think that with this growing awareness, I think with the pandemic, if people didn't walk away from the pandemic with a different perspective about their lives, either reprioritization, jokingly, a friend of mine said, that with the pandemic, people either became a chunk, a hunk, or a drunk. But I think there's a lot of truth in that many people were like, hey, there's no time but the present to start prioritizing my health, taking care of myself, thinking about how I want to live my life. And I do think that there are more people that appear to be embracing out of curiosity the concept of fasting. And certainly it's not weird anymore. Like when I started talking about it, 8 years ago, people thought I was, again, crazy, but I realized I was just ahead of my time. And so I think for a lot of different reasons, I'm glad that it's not such a new concept for so many people. And it's encouraging people to think against the common narrative. I always say, if you want to be different, if you don't want to be a common narrative, because the common denominator right now is you are not metabolically healthy, you are not physically active, you are not sleeping well, and then I can add in your stress is not well managed, and you're not going to end up living a great life. You're going to be the person that is going to be starting with high blood pressure medication, you're probably on cholesterol meds, you're going to be diabetic. Here in the United States right now, these GLP-1 agonists, Ozempic, Wegovy, these drugs that have really kind of taken off. And because in many ways, people don't have to change their habits. And so, that's kind of the common prevailing theme of, oh, well, don't change your diet, just take this drug. I think we're starting to see some shifts. And I think that's certainly really encouraging.
So I'm on board with so much of what you're saying. So I wake up in the morning. If I wake up in the morning and I have, I'm thinking back to when I was a kid and my mom would feed me these like really high sugar cereals for breakfast. And I'd inevitably get that elevated insulin levels, the slump. And then, through my college years, I relied heavily to almost self-prescribe during that slump with energy drinks or caffeinated beverages of some kind to pull myself out of that slump until the next meal. And I'd be on just this roller coaster of energy all day. And I've heard you talk and you've characterized people into kind of fat burners and sugar burners. But what I still struggle to understand in this is, where do athletes fall into this? Because we've overwhelming evidence that carbohydrates are beneficial for performance and neutralizing insulin effects during performance. So it's, how can I have my cake and eat it, almost, is the question. How can I get the benefits of carbohydrates and insulate myself from the negative effects of this insulin roller coaster?
Well, ideally, we want to be able to use different types of fuel substrates, whether it's carbohydrates or stored glycogen, fats or fatty acids, or even ketones. When we are metabolically flexible, we can use any of those. So even in an athlete, they want to be able to, if you're sprinting, you're going to use a different type of fuel than someone that's doing a long endurance race, and helping people understand that the average person isn't able to effectively use different types of fuel substrates. The average person is the person that is using predominantly glycogen or stored sugar as their fuel source. And that's why they deal with being hangry. That's why they have to eat with greater meal frequency. That's why they struggle to lose weight. They become weight loss resistant. They have energy slumps. Like you mentioned, you would self-medicate with energy drinks because you had this slump, probably from too much carbohydrate. So I think obviously this is not my area of expertise, but when I talk to people that are athletic or are athletes, it's helping them understand, like, I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that, oh, if I use carbohydrates as a fuel substrate, that's bad. No, we want to be able to use fats, ketones. We want to be able to use glucose as a fuel substrate. And we don't want to be stuck in this paradigm of thinking we eat to stoke our metabolism, that we eat lots of, we call it heart healthy grains here, which couldn't be further from the truth. But understanding that someone who is flexible in terms of what types of fuel their body uses are the ones that are going to be able to show up and perform athletically, intellectually, psychologically.
So for somebody that's training, be that cycling, running, triathlon, gym going, whatever, in the evenings, but something that's not a steady state aerobic, that there is periods where there's a glycogen demand on this activity, and they're doing that in the evenings, how would you structure a day? Would you still be fasting up until lunch, going with kind of a 16-8 fasting protocol, and then breaking that and maybe transitioning to something lower glycemic carb just before the activity? Or how would you structure that dietary day?
I think, so bioindividuality rules, and I mean this like from very much from a medicine perspective, but also my clinical experience, that you could take 10 men and women, and they may all be people who really enjoy working out at night. And some of them may say to you, I can eat like a hearty size lunch, a smaller dinner, and then I can go to the gym. Some people feel like they need a little bit of fruit before their workout. Other people don't feel like they need that. I find for me that the individuals that have been doing fasting for a period of time do absolutely fine if they're in a fasted state or if they've had a meal 3 or 4 hours before. I think that a lot of it is really dependent on their degree of physical activity. Like, do you have a job where you're sitting on your butt all day long? Or are you someone that is a day laborer? Or are you someone that's a tennis coach and you're running up and down the court, training your clients? And so you're very physically active. And so I always say that, that carbohydrate load for me in particular, obviously most of my clients are middle-aged people. So we'll talk to them about protein. Every meal is focused on protein, and you're either protein and healthy fats or protein and carbohydrates. Because, from my perspective, the low carb movement in many ways has gotten a bad rap because people have kind of overdone the low carb thing. And there are individuals who do benefit from a little bit more discretionary carbohydrate. They're usually my younger, leaner patients that are more metabolically flexible. But when I think about someone that's transitioning from, we call it a standard American diet, but someone that's eating 6 to 10 times a day, and that is the average, which is really surprising. But as you're transitioning from that to maybe you're having 3 meals a day, maybe you're having a snack in between, taking away the snacks, really making sure you're eating enough protein. Like, I'm very protein centric because we recognize our protein needs change throughout our lifetime, but especially north of 40. Making sure that individuals, when they're sitting down to have meals, have enough protein, adding in the carbohydrates if they've earned them, meaning if you are physically active, you're doing demanding work, you're really depleting your glycogen stores because you're doing either, very heavy lifting, intense lifting in the gym, or you're doing high intensity interval training or a lot of Tabata. You've really depleted your glycogen stores. And I have some clients that will actually tell me they can tell when they're at that point where they need to be more conscientious about replacing their carbohydrates. But I think a 16-8, going from not snacking to 3 meals to making sure you've allocated enough protein. And then, if you can get enough protein in your feeding window, that's really key. If you can get an 8-hour window, 2 or 3 meals, and you can have ideally 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight, then I'm okay with someone doing a 16-8. I do have clients right now that are actually having wider feeding windows because they just can't get enough protein in that time frame. So I think if it's largely dependent on what life stage you're in, how physically active you are, and understand that carbohydrates aren't intrinsically bad. It's really more about the quality of the carbs. So not the cakes and the cookies, but maybe you have sweet potato or low glycemic berries or some citrus fruit, and that's, the fiber and everything else will fill you up. It's not the same as these highly processed, hyper palatable carbohydrates that most people are attracted to because they're easy to overeat. To be totally transparent, a lot of it's like, what's someone's motivation? Some people just want to look great naked. Some people have an event coming up they want to look good for. And other people have more kind of substantive perspectives that they're like, okay, I don't want to age in reverse, but I want to make sure that I can chase after my kids, eventually my grandkids. I want to make sure I can still hike. I want to make sure that I can still do these long cycling rides.
And that piece is really interesting because I listened to Peter Attia talking about this, where if you baseline your physical strength, your endurance levels, and a bunch of different markers now, and then you map the expected decline, and then you cross-check that against a list of stuff you hope to be able to do when you're 60 years old, you can say with pretty decent certainty, no, you're not going to be able to play on the floor with your grandchildren. That requires quite a lot of physical strength to be on the floor, core stability. So you can rule that out unless, to use your phrase, you start pushing back against that muscular decline now.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. I mean, I have on social media, and I'm an introvert, so I hate taking my phone into the gym and taking photos. But
That's a
people
good thing.
love. No, I mean, I'm such a like. I always say like I'm an open book about a lot of things, but my gym time is my time. I mean, I'm not on my phone other than to like listen to a podcast or a book. Ironically enough, I was listening to Peter Attia's book this morning, but helping people understand that, you know, when I look at my peers, like I went to my 30th high school reunion a few years ago, and I was looking at my peers. I was like, wow, like the choices we make have a huge net impact, not just on the physicality and the body composition stuff, but just looking at people who looked inflamed and haggard and tired. And so I have all boys, and I remind them all the time, this is why your dad and I still like are very physically active, and, you know, make sure we go to the gym. And, you know, I was just saying to my husband last night, we really should start doing pickleball because there's a lot of benefits with that hand-eye coordination. And he was kind of laughing like, oh my God, we're like every middle-aged couple, you know, wanting to find new activities. And I said, no, but actually it's so good for brain health. So I think to your point, understanding like we don't want to lose strength, or we want to do everything we can to maintain it. We want to maintain muscle mass. We want to ensure that we are, clear cognitively. There's a UK study talking about just step count. I mean, something that is so seemingly benign, but like step count contributes to, reduction in cognitive decline for people over the age of 65. And so something as simple as walking every day that people don't even think anything of. I'm like always trying to get my patients, like, I want you to walk more. I want you to park farther away. And there's a reason for that. Like there's a minimum amount of steps that I want my patients to be hitting on a daily basis, because it gives us a sense of, are we sitting on our butts all day long, which we know is, problematic in and of itself. So I agree with you that, kind of tracking those metrics. That's why, glucometers, continuous glucose monitors. I have an Oura Ring. I have an Apple Watch. I mean, I like to track metrics, and I encourage patients, within their budgets to be able to do the same so they can determine, what is working well for them or what is not.
Cynthia, I've absolutely loved chatting in a pretty insane world. You're a welcome, sane voice across the internet, and you're a resource that I return to again and again. So I'm going to link up your various social platforms and your book and everything else in the show notes, and encourage everyone to go and check that out. Thank you very much for the time to chat with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
If you enjoyed that episode, press here for a selection of the best podcast conversations I've had. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you next time.